going to show you a really fun little modification you can do to the everyday shirt or another fitted shirt that you might like. It's using stretch lace like this for the neckband. You do need a stretch lace trim that is pretty stretchy. Some of them barely stretch at all. That's not going to work. You're going to need a fairly stretchy one with lots of spandex. You can also use picot elastic, which is used a lot in lingerie and underwear, bras. This is the easiest way to do it, I think. It's doing it in the flat. You sew up one shoulder and then you take your stretch lace. And if it's like mine had a very pretty scalloped edge and then the other edge was just flat. So I wanted to make sure that when I had it right sides together with my shirt, the scalloped one is the one that's going to show. And I actually grabbed the wrong end, not once but twice. So mine also had a very distinguishable front and back. So make sure you have the side that you want, right sides together. And if yours is like mine and one side scalloped, put the scallop on away from the raw edge of the neckline. What I'm doing is I'm going to baste it on. You can try to calculate how much you need, but the thing with stretch lace and picot is it's varies quite a lot. If you really want to calculate it, I would recommend starting around 90 to 95% of the neckline. You don't want to stretch it very much. If you can see, I'm stretching it slightly, but not a ton. You don't want to stretch it enough that it's going to gather your shirt up. That's why I highly suggest basting it as well, and why I think it's a little bit easier to do in the flat versus doing it in the round. But you can do it in the round if you would rather not have the seam on the neckline. Again, I'm just stretching it a little bit as I'm attaching it, and I'm just basting it on the longest straight stitch that your machine has. I did a 1/2 inch seam allowance here, and then I'm just going to check, do I like that? I thought mine was a little bit thick, so when I go back over it, I'm going to take an even bigger seam allowance. It's going to make my neckline a little bit lower. But I know the everyday shirt pattern doesn't have a very low neck, so I don't mind a lower neckline either. You can see it gathered just a little bit. If it's gathering just a little bit, that'll be okay. You can top stitch it and it's going to stretch when it's on. The everyday shirt is nice and fitted and snug, so it will stretch a little bit. Same with the neckband kind of floating away. You want it flat to your body instead of sticking straight up. But when you stretch it onto your body, that will take care of a little bit. So if it's not perfect, if you have a mannequin on or just slide it on your body, it will take away some of the looseness or tightness, both. So as you can see, I'm taking a bigger seam allowance here. Again, still just basting it because I want to make sure that I like it before I take my final stitch. And the thing with lace is they're all a little bit different. Same with picot, they can vary quite wildly with how stretchy they are, how much recovery they have. Same with lace, stretch lace trim. So this is how I like to do it because I don't like to calculate a certain amount because they vary so much. And then I just like to make sure I like it before I make that final stitch. I always baste it on because it's very easy to kind of get it a little loose and then it sticks away from the body, or a little tight and it's gathering your shirt a little bit. So I really recommend basting it on. So now I'm going to double check, do I like that seam allowance better? I do. That one's more of what I was going for, so I'm going to keep the bigger seam allowance here. And if you're like me, I'm just using stretch lace that I had in my stash. If you are buying stretch lace, I do recommend buying a thinner one. I think mine was over an inch wide, which isn't super wide for stretch lace, but you can get thinner for sure. All right, now I'm going to make my final stitch, and I'm going to take it at that deeper seam allowance. So as you can see, I'm cutting off, about 3/8 of an inch instead of 1/4 of an inch. I might even be taking off a whole 1/2 inch. So my neckline will be a little bit deeper than the original pattern, but again, I've tried this pattern several times, and I know that a deeper neckline will be just fine. When you do your final stitch, you do still need to stretch that lace to fit the neckline a little bit. Basting should hold it in place for you really nicely though. You can stretch your neckline. Whoops, I always do that, y'all. My camera is literally right in my face, between my face and the sewing machines. It's so difficult not to accidentally bonk. So I'm sorry, but I try my best here. All right, you can give it a good stretch and pop any basting stitches that are still there. You can give it a good press. Be careful of pressing your stretch lace or your picot because they're usually synthetic. So use a pressing cloth or very low synthetic heat. As you can see, my lace is still wanting to stick up a little bit, but when it stretches onto my body, it's gonna lay nicely. So it doesn't need to be super perfect off your body. I do recommend pressing though. And if it's gathering up a ton or really sticking straight up, you can remove it and try again. It doesn't need to be absolutely perfect yet though. If you're not sure, maybe it's gathering up a little bit and you think, I don't know if it's going to look okay when it's on or not, baste this shoulder together and then slip it on. And if it's not, you can always take it off and retry on the lace. That's why I suggest basting. You can always pin it together too if you don't want to baste. I always prefer basting. I think it's quicker and easier to try on as well. You can even baste up the side seams. I mean, it's only going to take about 30 seconds and you can slip it on and see how the neckline is laying on you. This is how I like to finish along this shoulder since it isn't in the round. I usually hate doing things in the flat like this, but I do think it's easier with this because again, sometimes I need to remove the lace and either add a little bit more or take a little bit away. I go all the way to the edge on my serger and then I pop my foot up. I do go nice and slow on the edge to make sure I'm right on the edge of that lace. Pop my foot up, flip my piece around, and then go backwards a little bit. That way it finishes off that serger edge for me. I don't have to worry about doing anything else. And there it is. As you can see, it's not quite as pretty as if I did it in the round, but I am positive that my neckline's gonna lay nice and pretty. Last thing you have to do is top stitch if you want. I do always top stitch when I'm doing a lacy neckline because I don't want the seam allowance to pop up under the lace. And since it's sheer, the lace is sheer, you could see the seam allowance. So I make sure to top stitch it, even though it is optional. I do highly recommend. This is where you can also fix a little mistake. If you have any part of your seam that is gathered, maybe you pulled and stretched your lace a little too tight along a section. If you stretch it slightly, the shirt slightly as you're top stitching, it's going to smooth out some of those gathers. So if it is gathering up on you even after you've pressed, because you pulled your lace a little too tight, as you can see, I have a little gathering right here at the end. So as I'm top stitching this little section right here, I'm just going to stretch my fabric a little bit to help smooth out those gathers just a little bit. It's not going to fix a ton of gathering, but it will help smooth them out if you have just a little bit. So you can see I stretch it with that left hand as I'm going through. I must have pulled it a little bit tighter there at the very end. Now all we have to do is press. Again, be careful if your lace is synthetic, using high heat on your iron. If they are nylon, which they often are, it will melt. So be careful. But you do want to press it. And again, if it's still, you can see mine is sticking up. It's not laying completely flat on the table. Pressing will help. And also when it's being worn, this shirt is nice and fitted. Okay, so it's going to stretch on my body just like that. And you can see just even the slightest stretch, and then my neckband's going to lay flat. Okay, so it's hard to get lace stretched enough to lay perfectly flat without gathering your shirt. So if you're going to err on one side, you can err a little bit on not stretching it as much, and then when it's on your body, it'll stretch slightly. I also added lace to the bottom. It's just a fun little thing. This is the crop, so it is going to add a little bit of length as well. It also helps kind of bring the waist in because it's almost like a band on the end of the shirt, right? Or a cuff on a long sleeve shirt. The lace is much more stable than the knit fabric. I'm also going to show you how you can do it in the round. This is the same method that you would use in the neckline if you want to do it in the round on the neckline. Okay, so you're going to start where you want your seam, and then you're going to give yourself a little bit of a seam allowance. And you're going to leave, I like to leave about 2 inches unsewn. Okay, and we're going to sew this seam later once we're all done. So again, there's where I want the seam. I want it to line up with my side seam. I put my lace about 1/2 inch past that seam, and then I'm going to start sewing about 2 inches. So along the hem, you do not want to stretch your lace. You don't want to bring it in. It's already going to be more stable than your fabric. It's already going to feel tighter than a regular hem. So you're just going to let your machine go and feed them both in nice and naturally. I overlapped it probably about 3/8 of an inch. You can overlap it however much you feel comfortable with. You can do as little as 1/4 of an inch, as big as, 5/8 of an inch, whatever you're comfortable with. I did it about the foot width on my cover stitch because that was easy for me to maintain. So once we get to the edge, we're going to do it exactly the other way. We're going to stop sewing about 2 inches from that side seam. And of course you could sew this on your regular sewing machine as well. You just want to use your favorite stretch stitch. Personally, I love the triple step zigzag for attaching lace. And then we're going to sew our seam on the lace now. So we have about 2 inches on each side before we get the seam. And then I'm going to snip it about 1/2 inch past that side seam. So now once I cut it, both sides should go past that seam 1/2 inch. Now if you didn't get it perfectly, it's no big deal. I didn't get mine perfectly. I'll show you in just a minute. So here's where I want the seam. I'm going to put my, and again, I'm just showing you I've overlapped both of them, right? And so now I have room to have a seam here. You want them right sides together, and you want to align it to your seam. So I'm just checking it. I did it wrong sides together here just to make sure I have it nice and even, and then I'm just going to flip them. And I didn't have them even, if you could tell, one side went farther. So I'm just marking exactly where I want that seam and trying to align them perfectly together. It's a little bit more finicky to get nice and perfect than in the flat, but it does provide for a prettier finish at the end. So as you can see, I did not eyeball it very nicely. Okay, and there's my seam, and it lines up to the seam on my lace pretty well. And now I can trim off any extra. I'm going to sew this seam right here on my regular sewing machine, just with a straight stitch. And then I'm going to press the seam allowances open on the lace. I do like to trim the corners like this, and that's to help with the bulk and just to make sure the seam allowance doesn't poke out anywhere. And the stretch lace is not going to fray, so you don't need to worry about clipping it too tightly anywhere. So again, just aligning those seams right there. And now I'm just going to stitch anything that's not stitched the first time, right? So you can do the neckline just like this as well. Just make sure you baste it along the first time. And then once you're right here and you're stitching this part, you can go around the entire neckline with your final stitch. I hope you like this little mod. It's super fun. It's really trendy right now. I did this lace one for me. I did a white lace one for me. And then I made baby girl one, a little yellow one with the picot elastic. She loved it. She felt like a big girl in it. It also just makes me reminisce when this was in style when I was younger. So another really fun thing to do that is super on trend right now is adding a little embellishment on the front center, just below your neckline. You can get these at your local craft store if you're lucky enough to have one still around. You can also find them on Etsy. So you could do like a little bow like this. You can also create your own little bow from ribbon. I'm doing this little rosette. And all you do is hand stitch it on. Make sure you find the center and hand stitch it until you think it's nice and sturdy. If you're making it for someone and you think they might be rough with it, might tug on it, maybe a little one, or someone's just rougher with their clothes, or maybe you're worried they're not going to wash it very gently, you can put a little piece of interfacing on the wrong side and then stitch it to it to help add some sturdiness, okay? But it's a really fun, cute little look. I did a bow on my white one, and I did little rosettes on my lace one. If you sew one of these up with this mod, don't forget to share with me. I absolutely love seeing your makes, so don't leave me out. Until next time, bye y'all.